Senator Dawson.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Today to speak about Bill C-11, an Online Streaming Act, and to update you on the key legislative priority, the modernization of the Broadcasting Act. As you know, I put second reading in June, so this is officially the speech, but we have already started the study and we're going forward during the next few weeks. Moderniser la loi, c'est la mettre à jour et
The intention is to prepare the future. That should be done in a way that takes into account technological realities, the dynamics concerned, and the Act must set up an updated regulatory framework with clear orientation and the necessary tools and with enough flexibility.
Initiatives put forward by the government to create a forward-thinking digital policy agenda, including the Online News Act and the government's commitment to address online safety. Bill C-11 aligns with other acts and legislative instruments and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. It also helps Canada fulfill its international commitments, such as the UNESCO Convention on Diversity of Cultural Expression and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. On doit moderniser la loi sur la
The Act must be modernized, and that should be done now.
Theaters and broadcasting industry have been asking for. Bill C-11 is important to Canadians. We have heard from our cultural sectors that the passage of Bill C-11 is important. We have heard from our broadcasting sectors that it is important that the passage be done urgently. While we studied C-11 at committee, I'm sure we have all received a significant number of correspondence on this bill, as you've all told me once, and many of you have told me in the past. However, I want to take a moment to urge some caution and critical consideration. There has been a great deal of misinformation circulated by the opponents of this bill with little basis in reality or appreciations of the goals of the legislation. A large number of messages are driven by a sophisticated, well-organized campaign that makes use of computer-generated emails. The vast majority of messages I have received are clearly linked to automatically filled online forms, some of which contain totally untrue information about the bill. I would also like to note that many of those forms do not have any verification protection that ensures that they are real individuals sending these messages. I bring this up now only to urge caution. Our committee and our colleagues are carefully studying the modernization of the broadcasting framework, and this work is too important to be distracted by misinformation. The project of modernization has been considered for many years. A little-known fact is that 4 years ago in 2018, Transport and Communications began a study on the modernization of the Broadcasting Act. And we, at that time, decided to defer our study to the ongoing Broadcasting Telecommunications Legislative Review that was done by the government. That panel studied this issue for 2 years before publishing its report titled Canada's Communications Future, Time to Act. That report was published in January 2020. And now here we are in 2022. The task at hand is important work because we are already late. I stand before you again almost a year and a half since C-10 was introduced to modernize the 1991 Broadcasting Act. At that time, when I rose to introduce C-10 to you, I noted that the bill had already received considerable parliamentary input, with 112 days at committee stage at the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. Over 40 meetings and close to 50 witnesses, not counting departmental briefings. The bill reflected the work done by parliamentarians and substantial input from industry and community stakeholders. With C-11, the Standing Committee on Heritage held an additional 28 meetings with 46 briefs representing an input of 142 witnesses. Collectively, the interested parties have repeatedly recognized the need to modernize the Act, even as their opinions might differ on the details. In fact, all parties in the other place have signaled the modernization of the Broadcasting Act is a necessity. Whenever we talk about modernizing our broadcasting system, it is an opportunity to ask ourselves big questions about how we are as Canadians, how we want to define our culture, our stories. It was the same in 1981 and even in 1982. I was in the other place at that time, because as you know, I've been here for a long time. I was in the other place at that time and pushing to update the Act at that time, where American program that was threatening to overpower arts and cultures, the Arts and Culture Center. Notre culture, c'est nous tous.
Our culture is all of us. It's our past, it's our present, and it's our future. It's how we talk to each other.
More than 50 years, the Broadcasting Act has helped us share our stories. That's how we built our strong Canadian culture. That's how we forged our Canadian identity. And that's how we brought Canadian voices to the world. We want to build on this for the future. And so we must recognize that these times have changed. La dernière fois que notre système a été mis.
The last time our system was updated, our world was totally different. In 1991, we went to Blockbuster to rent our movies, and we had Walkmans. Some things have changed in 30 years. Online streaming has changed the way we create, discover, and consume content. We need our system to reflect that reality. For decades now, Canadian broadcasters have been investing in the system to create the content we love. It's only fair to ask online broadcasters to do their part. Companies like Netflix, Amazon, and Disney are already investing in the Canadian economy, and we like that. We like that they choose to make their projects in Canada. Let's be honest, they're doing it because they are incredible talent here. What this bill does is update our rules so that all distribution platforms contribute to our culture, period.
Has received more and more input. It was drafted to build upon the work done on C-10 at the last session with minimal targeted changes and a recalibrated approach to the social media. This bill has been updated to reflect the hard work of parliamentarians of all parties and caucuses. The government listened to the concerns and feedback from the last session and have updated the bill to address concerns surrounding user-generated content. It was further amendment at committee in the other place to strengthen protections on free speech. The Online Streaming Act is not about picking winners and losers. In the landscape of Canada's programming offers, it does offer as much as Canadians want. It does not compromise the personal freedoms of Canadians by censoring the internet. In fact, it specifies in multiple places throughout the text of the bill that freedom of expression must be protected. I cannot express this enough. Freedom of expression in Canada will not be impacted by this act. What it does is simple. It updates our legislation so that the broadcasting framework in Canada accounts for the realities of modern broadcasting and ensures a level playing field for those commercial players that can materially contribute to its objectives. This legislation will update Canada's broadcasting rules to include online streaming services. It will require them to contribute in an equitable way to our culture. If you benefit from the system, you should need to contribute to it. Simple. Our chamber has an important role to play within our democratic process. We have been asked to examine the bill, to study its merits and aims, and understand how it will work. As you know, our chamber authorized the Standing Committee of Transport and Communications to pre-study this bill, and we've been doing it since June. We actually came in last week before the session started to have committee meetings. I am pleased to advise that we have begun that work, so we have now repeatedly heard from creative sector that we need to pass this bill without delay. We owe it to our hardworking artists and creators to pass this bill. We owe it to them to make sure that the online streamers who benefit from our system contribute to the strength and vitality of Canada's cultural sector. Let's remember, Canada's strong culture is not an accident. We made that decision. We made that call. We choose to be different. We choose to be different from our neighbors to the south. We choose cultural sovereignty. At a high level, the Online Streaming Act addresses many important issues. The Online Streaming Act advances the interests of Canada and Canadians in several ways. Canadian broadcasters are suffering financial loss because they are being forced to compete on an uneven regulatory playing field. Passing this bill is crucial for sustaining the economic ecosystem for Canadian culture, music, and stories. It is needed to maintain our audiovisual production activity and keep our cultural industries working. It is recognized by music stakeholders as critical to supporting and making discoverable our music and stories. It creates dictated and intentional space within our broadcasting system for communities that are faced systematically marginalized for too long. Taking this work seriously includes getting it done, doing it right, and doing it urgently. The problem is that our broadcasting regulatory framework is out of date. This hurts our creative industries, doesn't serve the interests of Canadians or Canada, and limits our ability to realize the cultural broadcasting objectives that the Broadcasting Act is ultimately meant to support. These policy objectives are the instrument in shaping our Canadian culture. Digital disruption has happened, and our legislation must adapt. The reality is that our broadcasting has dramatically changed since 1991. Digital disruption in the sector has brought about a change at an unprecedented pace, heightened by the pandemic. The traditional services of radio, television, and cable are still important players in the broadcasting system. Yet these days, most Canadians regularly use online streaming services like Netflix, Spotify, Crave, CBC Gem, Club and Discovery Plus to listen to their favorite songs, watch films, and television shows. La raison en était que ces services avaient.
We have seen the impact that streaming services have had on our broadcasting system over the past decade. Innovative services had to be allowed to develop. Things that obtained in the past no longer obtain. Services should be able to contribute to Canadian history in the same way that the traditional media does.
These libraries are growing. They will see that what we all know is true. The Canadian market is lucrative. It's good to do business here in Canada. Online streamers compete directly with the regulatory broadcasters. In some cases, due to licensing the way Canadian consumers can view the latest and popular series like Bridgerton, Moon Knight is thoroughly streaming services. Even Kim's Convenience, content commissioned by the CBC, is being watched by Canadians on platforms like Netflix instead of on a Canadian service like Gem. I've been waiting a year to read it, so it's still a bit. Yet streaming services are not presently required to support the broadcasting system as their Canadian broadcasting counterparts are. They are benefiting from the Canadian market, but have no obligations to contribute back into it. This is a problem that requires urgent action, and one that the Online Streaming Act directly addresses. This is not a quick cash grab or a punishment to those who have enjoyed success in an unregulated environment. Canadians stream 2 billion songs in a single week. I repeat, Canadians stream 2 billion songs in a single week using services like Spotify and Apple Music. We know that there is a market for legitimately sourced music in Canada, ensuring that Canadians are paid when their music is played. This is about updating our laws and regulations to provide rules for our broadcasting system that make sense today and for tomorrow. It's about providing the certainty and structure for sustainable future success. We've heard from critics of this bill that we are trying to fit new technology into an outdated regulatory model. That could not be further from the truth. The Online Streaming Act would modernize Canada's broadcasting system, realigning our country's cultural priorities and future-proofing the framework as new technologies will inevitably arise. And we know that technology advancements can be happening at light speed. Just think that when we were debating C-10 last year, TikTok was a very different platform than what it is today. We need to build a system that will have the flexibility to adapt to new technology, and it is precisely what C-11 will accomplish. We've heard from Canadian broadcasters and producers that continue to dutifully contribute to Canada's culture sector and how they compete at a disadvantage with the entities that exist outside of our regulatory framework. I wrote this in '92 on the subject of broadcasting modernization. Unless new policy initiatives are introduced, the industry is at risk in the face of new technologies and global competition, which could destroy the infrastructure of Canadian program production. Technological innovation does not stop. We again face a challenge by new technology and global competition. And again, I'm calling for the modernization of our regulatory regime. Honourable Senators, we are faced with an important task. Righting the regulatory asymmetry between traditional and online broadcast undertakings has been delayed for too long. The process around modernizing the Broadcasting Act has seen remarkable debate, filibustering, and unreasonable claims of imagined breaches of our charter. These have obscured the real issues. I think it's enough. Il est temps de passer aux solutions.
It is time to move on to solutions. We need to address this regulatory challenge now by requiring that online audio and video broadcasting services contribute to important cultural policy objectives in the same way that traditional broadcasters have always done. Remember that under the 1991 Broadcasting Act, radio and television stations and cable and satellite distribution undertakings were required to be owned and controlled by Canadians and to hold licenses. They could and still can broadcast programs from the international market or carry American channels. In return for their participation in the Canadian broadcasting system and access to the domestic market, they were required to finance, acquire, and broadcast Canadian programs. They were also required to make programming available to Canadians and to contribute to the creation of Canadian programming, including in French, of course.
Our broadcasting system saw an increase in demand for Canadian programs, and our creative talent flourished, and our cultural industries saw predictable investments on which they could plan, build, and grow. The Online Streaming Act brings online broadcasters under similar rules and requirements as our traditional broadcasters. Because unlike traditional Canadian broadcasters, platforms prefer from our culture but have no obligations to contribute to it. And with money leaving the traditional broadcasters to go to these platforms, this is putting our creators, our industry, and our jobs at risk. We have to act. Colleagues, our system must also pave the way for new and upcoming Canadian artists. For decades, our current system introduced us to incredible artists that we all love. Many of them now share their art around the world. Anne of Green Gables, the tragically hip, crazy Drake, Charlotte Cadrin, Laura Fabian, Shawn Mendes, District 31, Schitt's Creek. We all know the list of Canadian successes. We want to make sure that our children and future generations grow up as we did, having the chance to watch our stories and listen to our songs. La culture est une...
Culture is a powerful fundamental form of expression. It allows us to live together, to experience moments, feelings, and dreams together. It allows us to build a common identity, and it has a greater reach and influence than ever before. We must be able to recognize ourselves in culture. We, Francophones across the country, rely on it. Our language and our culture depend on it. If we want our children to speak our language, we need a strong culture, and for that, we need a fair, equitable system.
In the years ahead. The bill aims for fair treatment of programs consumed on different platforms, regardless of how they are transmitted. New legislation will shift away from issuing broadcasting license to a new conditions of service model. This will allow the CRTC to seek contributions from other related to the discoverability and to the showcasing of programs. Canada's music stakeholders have expressed that the bill addresses their need for creative support and desire to be fairly promoted online. In this framework, broadcasting undertakings, including online undertakings, will be required to make financial contributions to support Canadians' music, stories, creators, and producers. There are two notable themes in the bill that merit some clear and specific mention. They are the treatment of digital-first creators and the recalibrated approach to social media. Digital-first creators will never face any, I repeat, will never face any obligations under the Online Streaming Act. In other words, a producer of audio-visual content that is primarily produced and intended for online distribution as a user-uploaded content on social media services will be excluded. There has been fear-mongering that the bill would create a world where 30% of a digital-first creator's revenues will have to contribute to an art fund. This is simply not true. There is no question about individual creators being asked to forfeit a portion of their revenues. We have been clear from the beginning. It is disappointing that the opposition continues to speculate wildly on alarming, far-reaching hypotheticals that simply will never happen. Some social media platforms may have to contribute, yes, but the revenues of digital-first creators will not be included in the calculation of social media platforms, of their revenues for the purpose of financial contribution. Content from digital-first creators will not face any obligation related to showcasing and discoverability. Despite some vocal critics of this issue, the concerns of Canadians' digital-first creators have been listened to. They have told us that they do not want to be part of this framework. They will be exempt, and I am confident that the policy direction of the CRTC will make this extra clear. A recalibrated approach to social media,
Content uploaded by Canadians on social media services such as Facebook or YouTube will not be subject to obligations except in clearly defined circumstances as set out in Section 4.2 of the Act. The Online Streaming Act only allows the CRTC to impose requirements on social media services for commercial content, such as commercial music. The legislation sets out 3 factors that the CRTC must consider in identifying commercial programming. It will consider the amount of revenue generated by the program, whether it's offered by other broadcasters, whether it's traditional or online, such as on Netflix or Spotify, and whether the content has been assigned an international standard code number. Social media broadcasts that do not generate revenue for the uploader or copyright holder will never be regulated. The reason for including these provisions is simple. A Celine Dion song should be treated the same on YouTube as it is on Spotify. It's really simple.
Social media responds to concerns about freedom of expression. At the same time, it takes into account that music is largely distributed and broadcasted online. More and more, we are seeing social media companies broadcast commercial content. YouTube Music is a prime example. That's why this bill includes important updates that will only focus on relevant types of commercial content. In fact, a study conducted by Media Technology Monitor in 2020 found that about 2/3 of Canadian adults used YouTube to listen to music, which outpaces dedicated music services such as Apple Music and Spotify. The proposed amendments to the Online Streaming Act regarding social media will not apply to content uploaded by users or to users themselves. They will only apply to commercial content based on these specific criteria. This responds to the needs of music stakeholders who stated that the platforms who broadcast commercial music must contribute to the system. The minister met with social media content creators, including YouTubers and other digital creators, and heard their concerns. And here at the Senate, we are continuing to listen to them. These creators share incredible content with audience here in Canada and around the world. But this bill is not about them and will not require them to do anything new. And if I haven't been crystal clear on this yet, let me add that once and for all that this bill has gone through parliamentary process and received, after it's gone through parliamentary process and received royal assent, it will be made even more clear to the regulatory through a policy directive that this legislation does not touch users, only streaming platforms. Platforms are in, users are out. I want to be absolutely clear. This law will never control what Canadians can or cannot see online. We will always be able to choose what we listen to and what we watch. Users are not broadcasters, their content will not be regulated, and individual online creators will not be regulated. Again, the principle is simple. Platforms are in, users are not. In sum, the new approach to social media online streaming will ensure that social media services contribute to the Canadian broadcasting system when appropriate and fair, while respecting rights and freedoms and choices of Canadians. To help understand why action is urgently needed, let us review the current economic reality in the sector. Broadcasting is an important economic driver, which supports Canadian creative services and the evolving cultural identity. Together, Canada's broadcasting, film and video and music recording sectors contribute $14 billion to Canada's GDP and over 160,000 jobs. That's in 2019.
Yet, over the past decade, the number of subscribers to streaming services has grown from 6 to 78% of Canadians. Even while streaming services have experienced rapid and substantial revenue growth, while traditional broadcasters have seen their revenues decline. This is no surprise.
We know that the world of broadcasting has changed. In addition to this new reality, Canada's broadcasting sector is facing long-term structural challenges. Without intervention, current trends in the market are expected to result in a decline in the production of Canadian television content by approximately $500 million within the next 5 years. That means there will be 13% less Canadian television production in 2025 than there was in 2020. And in 2020, we had already seen a $320 million drop in production from the 2018 levels. We have learned from our witnesses at committee that, for example, the first time there are more householders in Quebec with online subscriptions than traditional television service. And that online streaming market is overwhelmingly dominated by foreign players outside Canada's regulatory framework.
According to a survey conducted by Léger for ADISC, which we heard about, 60% of the Quebec population says that the radio is a tool to discover music, but at the same time, 61% of people now listen to music through online services, and these services escape any regulation. In Quebec, 8% of music listened to online is in French.
Long-term support for the system is required to enable ongoing success for Canadian creators, producers, and broadcasters. This is what this modernization is about. This is what the Online Streaming Act will achieve.
The status quo is unacceptable.
Main element of this legislation. Ensuring the continued viability of the Canadian broadcasting is also about our cultural sovereignty. Culture can play a role in the process of truth-telling and reconciliation with Indigenous people and healing. Diversity and inclusion are Canadian values, and they must be the elements of our cultural policy. This is a key pillar of the new Online Streaming Act.
These are some of the cultural policy issues, then, addressed by the Online Streaming Act. Improving the fairness of our broadcasting system means being more inclusive, supporting the livelihoods of Canadian artists and creators, and enriching the lives of Canadians who want to see more of themselves on screen and in song.
Racialized Canadians, women, and LGBTQ people and persons with disability deserve to have space in order to tell their stories to other Canadians and to the world. The amendments adopted at the committee in the other place further enshrine the importance of everybody being reflected in our broadcasting system. This bill claims that the space and makes sure that online streaming platforms contribute to Canadian culture.
Right now, our Canadian broadcasters are subject to one set of rules, while the streaming platforms are subject to another set of rules.
This legislation provides real gains for Canadians, including community media and local news, French language production, and racialized communities, third language program, and so much more. Importantly, this legislation also takes steps to ensure space within our broadcasting system for Indigenous storytelling and Indigenous languages.
It should be fair to everyone, and that's exactly what we're going to do with the Online Streaming Act. Because if you take advantage of the system, you should contribute to the system, period.
Through the process that will happen after this bill receives royal assent. The government will issue a policy direction to the CRTC to indicate our priorities when it comes to putting in place the new regulatory framework. The policy direction has two primary goals. First, it will focus on the importance of consultation and special consideration of the needs of equity-seeking groups. Second, the direction will make clear the areas where regulation is needed, as well as the areas where it should be exercised. After the policy direction is published, all stakeholders, including members of the public, will have ample opportunity to participate in the regulatory process and provide their feedback. Let me emphasize, we are putting in place a regulatory process like in other sectors. That means there will be publication of the proposed policy direction, followed by public consultation, and then final policy direction. This would be a fully collaborative process with online platforms, traditional media and creators, as well as the general public. The CRTC, in turn, will have its own public process as it further develops to implement the legislation. This will be done within the clear limits established by the legislation and in keeping with the policy direction provided by the government. Canada can be a leader on the global stage for innovative measures that benefit Canada's creative industries and grow its economy in a fast-moving digital and data-driven world. The Online Streaming Act seizes the opportunity to support our dynamic cultural sector in an ever-changing digital context. This bill and its outcomes will serve as examples of how well-thought-out policy mechanism can result in positive changes for years to come. We need good outcomes, especially for our Canadian artists and creators and our broadcasters who have waited too long for this to occur. The time to act on these measures is overdue. While some critics say that we are trying to focus on a moving target, that is a misconception. The government is looking to the future, to how we can support our culture, not just maintain the status quo, but challenge it in the interest of Canadian creatives. I want to spend a couple of minutes clarifying what the bill will not do. The Online Streaming Act is not about regulating the Internet. It will not affect Canadians' ability to use the Internet. The bill does not apply to the content generated by Canadians on their favorite social media platforms. The CRT does not and will not have the power or ability to have content removed from an individual's social media feed or personal website. This is not the purpose of the bill C-11. The bill clearly outlines the regulator will have no power to regulate everyday use of social media by Canadians. Let me be clear, the government will not regulate users, online creators, through the bill or the policy directive. The Act is not about censoring personal videos or social media or political discourse, nor is it about taxing them. It is about Canadian culture and our cultural industry. Not digital-first creators, not influencers, not users. Only the online streaming companies themselves will have new responsibilities under the Online Streaming Act. That is the goal, and this is the objective of the bill to attain these goals. For instance, let's consider a service base in the Philippines as an example, since there have been concerns raised at the committee. The Filipino channel, TFC, streams content in Tagalog and has been presented as a popular service for hundreds of thousands of Tagalog-speaking Canadians across the country. I want to assure everybody that services like TFC will not be hindered by the Act, and there is certainly nothing in this legislation that would cause the TFC to block Canadians from accessing its services.
What do we want to accomplish? This bill is about treating all broadcasters fairly, whether they are streaming services or traditional broadcasters. That is our main objective. Any service used to distribute commercial programming, whether in our homes, cars, or pockets, will be required to contribute to Canadian stories and music.
The Online Streaming Act brings with it many opportunities. It presents the chance to achieve greater diversity of perspectives, make and cement gains for many communities, and ensure inclusive support within our broadcasting sector. To provide greater diversity of perspectives and inclusive support to that represent and align our communities, Canadians with diverse backgrounds must see a broadcasting system that reflects the importance of diversity and inclusion. C-11 strengthens our broadcasting system by including explicit broadcasting policy objectives requiring that it should include all Canadians. Another strengthened objective requires that accessibility and barrier-free program be provided. Accessible and inclusive broadcasting is not an afterthought. They are the foundational pillars to build on. En matière de diversité et d'inclusion,
one of the goals of Bill C-11 in terms of diversity and inclusion is to focus on diverse and marginalized voices. Historically, these voices have been underrepresented in our broadcasting system. The goal is to expand content choices for all viewers and listeners who have trouble finding content that reflects their realities. To achieve this goal, the broadcasting system must support and promote programming and creators from diverse communities and backgrounds.
Cannot be made current without ensuring that all Canadians from diverse communities and backgrounds can see themselves reflected and supported. While some lament that niche markets will be lost, this is not true. The proposed legislation makes space for all It cements that we are a country that is not only invites diversity, but encourages and supports its creation. It is modernizing our approach to Canadian culture in an increasingly digital world. La législation doit être modifiée.
Legislation must be amended to ensure that broadcasting in Canada evolves with the necessary framework and space for Canadians who are from Francophone, Indigenous, racialized, or diverse communities on the basis of their ethno-cultural background, socioeconomic status, abilities, disabilities, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, and age. And the Online Streaming Act proposes to do this.
Removes the previous limitations as resources become available for persons. With respect to providing programs that reflect the Indigenous culture of Canada within our broadcasting system, I am pleased that the amendments adopted in the other place last spring go further in enshrining the importance of Indigenous stories in our broadcasting system. This is, as it should be, long overdue. New technologies and platforms Canadian revitalization of Indigenous languages, and it saddens me to see too many Indigenous languages on the brink of extinction. Ensuring space for Indigenous people to have narrative sovereignty is important and will support our efforts to revitalize Indigenous languages. Modernizing the Act will include changes to help Indigenous peoples tell their stories from their viewpoint and to see themselves represented in our broadcasting system. This bill emphasizes the importance of Indigenous-controlled broadcasting services and production. And APTN was in front of the committee this week and strongly support the passage of this legislation. French language programming is a cornerstone of our broadcasting future. Le projet de loi C-11
Bill C-11 strengthens original French language content and production, which should not rely solely on dubbing and subtitling. Both traditional and online broadcasters must make original French language content a priority on their platforms. More and more voices are speaking up to note that the foreign offering is predominantly in English and disproportionate to the original French content and production. And yet the needs of French-speaking communities are very large across the country.
In the previous Parliament, and updated the Act to better enshrine these measures in legislation. La loi sur la diffusion continue en...
The Online Streaming Act strengthens original French language content and production by specifying that broadcasting in Canada must support the production and broadcasting of original French language programs. The CRTC must support the availability of Canadian programs created and produced in French. The CRTC will have the power to issue conditions of service, including those concerning the proportion of original French language programming. As a senator from Quebec, it's particularly important for me to ensure continued support for the Quebec audiovisual media market. I would like to focus on the reality of Francophone and Anglophone minorities in particular. Linguistic duality in Canada is rooted in our Canadian broadcasting system. The legislation responds to the new needs and interests of Anglophone and Francophone minority communities, which now require to be identified and named in the Act to ensure their long-term vitality and development. And my colleague, Senator Cormier, is smiling. I think that's what he's asked for as well, and it was heard in the other house, in the other chamber. The Online Streaming Act contains objectives for English and French-speaking minority communities. It clarifies that any interpretation and application of the Act must respect the federal government's commitment to enhance the vitality of these communities and support their development, as well as the recognition and use of official languages in Canadian society. The CRTC must also promote the presentation of programs created and produced by these communities and take into account their specific needs and interests. The broadcasting system, including the new online players, make up indispensable vessels for the transmission of language and culture in Canada.
We must act now. Through the pandemic, our artists have been a source of inspiration, breathing life and support into our diverse communities daily. They revitalize the spirit of our culture. They elevate it with resolve that what constitutes our heritage as Canadians. On l'a dit, on l'a vu, on...
We've said it, we've seen it, we've experienced it. COVID-19 has accelerated our transition online. Physical distancing has driven Canadians to online platforms and delivery services. Canadians are communicating with friends and family online. Millions of people are telecommuting, students are taking classes online, and many are escaping these difficult times through online music, TV shows, and movies.
Facing many pandemic-related challenges that have severely limited their revenue streams for almost 2 years. An imbalanced system with unequal obligations is only making this situation worse for our artists, creators, and for our culture. With fewer resources, fewer opportunities, and fewer productions, Canadian music and stories will become harder and harder to find. Without intervention, current trends in the market are expected to result in a decline in the production of Canadian television content of almost $1 billion by 2023, compared to 2018. This is only a measure of the economic loss. The truth is our cultural identity is at stake. Un espace culturel distinct nous permet de se parler et de se comprendre.
A distinct cultural space will allow us to speak and build our identity. It will help us to find solutions to national issues. As this space is eroding, our links are also eroding. Our stories, our values, our histories are also disappearing. Productions by women, racialized communities, LGBTQ2+ communities, and disabled communities are more and more threatened by the lack of space to thrive. We have acted and we will continue to act to protect our culture, our jobs, and Canadian interests. The Online Streaming Act will directly contribute to the vitality of Canadian culture. We want online broadcasters to do their fair share to contribute to Canadian society. We want them to highlight shows in English, French, and Indigenous languages. And we want shows that represent other communities as well. Canadian broadcasting and cinema sectors, as well as television production sectors, are a major part of the Canadian economy. Interactive medias have added more than $19 billion to Canada's GDP and created thousands of jobs. This act will help us remain competitive. Maintain this vital sector. We need to help the creators adapt.
Has broad support across Canada's cultural industries. Moreover, this bill is in the public interest. It is about making sure that we continue to uphold Canadian values in our society as technology and consumer habits evolve. After all, we are not citizens, we are also consumers. I look forward to continuing our study on the Online Streaming Act at the committee, including tonight, where it can receive careful consideration that I know it deserves.
As the Minister of Canadian Heritage likes to say, a day without culture would be boring. I'd say that a country without culture would be depressing.
Of hard work and consultations on the part of Canadians, industry stakeholders, and parliamentarians. I want to thank them all for their thoughtful insight and hard work. And while we start the debate at this very important legislation, let's remember that at the end of the day, this is about updating our system to reflect today's digital reality. Things have changed. Streaming platforms are the new big players. This bill makes sure that everyone contributes in a similar and equitable way to our culture. The objectives of our cultural policy broadcasting system have not changed. It is about fairness. It is about good middle-class jobs in the cultural center. It's about having the power to shape our own culture. It's about making sure that everyone can see ourselves in our culture. It's about being proud of who we are, of being Canadians. Ensemble, on donne un bel avenir à la culture.
Together, we're giving a bright future to Canadian art, culture and to our artists and creators. We are giving Canadians the space they need to talk to each other, understand each other, share their art, here and around the world. We are creating a solid foundation for Canada in the digital age. The Internet brings many other challenges, but we can't face them as long as there are outdated rules that exclude some people and leave others behind. We must act decisively to protect our economy and our culture.
Senators to stand up for Canadian culture and support this legislation. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
Honourable Senator, Senator Dawson's time has expired. However, we have exactly 2 minutes before we adjourn. So if you are in agreement, I had on my list Senator Tanis, Senator Batters. So in 2 minutes, do the maximum, if Senator Dawson will take a question. Senator Tanis.
Thank you. Senator Dawson, I hope you'll take a question. You mentioned that 61% of Quebecers use a streaming service for music in addition to the radio, but only 8% of the music that they choose is Canadian content. So, sorry? Or it's French. So under the rules, would we be empowering some government body to force people to listen to more than 8%? Is there anything in there, and this could be used for, you know, Spotify in other parts of the country. Radio, there's mandatory 30% must be Canadian content. Is that what's going to happen? Are we going to have folks being told what to listen to on Spotify because they haven't listened to enough Canadian content? You just provide some assurance on that.
Madame la Présidente, ça va?
Madam Speaker.
We don't have those 30% quotas. We don't have those. And again, the situation has changed so much that even those quotas exist, they're not obviously being respected. So no, there will be no obligation. There will be encouragement. There will be negotiations between the CRTC and the big players so that they can find ways to put Canadian content, French Canadian content, multicultural content on their platforms. But no forcing of anybody to do anything, and certainly nothing that will attack freedom. Freedom is guaranteed in this act, and it will be respected.